evening to hang out and chat. I'm really excited for this conversation. My name is Eleanor Migoto. I'm the CEO and co-founder of JobStep. Our mission at JobStep is to break down barriers into tech careers. And one of the ways that we're doing that is hosting events like these with wonderful people like Jillian, to share and raise awareness of growing careers and industries, and particularly how to thrive in them. What JobStep does, our day job, as it were, our day job is to provide the fastest and easiest way to get a better job. We are the first and only resource that guarantees job seekers 5 interviews in 6 weeks to better paying jobs. And we do this by pairing the expertise of our great job coaches, many of whom are on this call, like Joy and Max, with technology that finds and applies to great jobs for you. So I am so excited to have this conversation with Jillian. Jillian and I have talked about culture and career transitions and how do you make tech, which is just such a great opportunity to have fulfilling careers and problem solve and build cool things, and make this accessible to people who might not have known anyone who worked in this industry because it's new. So without further ado, I'll let Jillian introduce herself. Actually, sorry. And Jillian Hufnagel is a JobStep advisor and currently the head of culture at Slim.AI, which is one of the fastest growing early stage startups in the Boston area.
Thanks for having me. It's great to see everybody. I'm very interactive, so I expect to engage with you guys and gals and all of your children that are Zoom bombing you and your pets that are walking across your keyboard. This is a human first conversation, and we know that there's a lot of other folks that are sharing your spaces. So be yourselves, be comfortable. Art school dropout turned receptionist, turned office manager, turned executive assistant, turned chief of staff, turned head of culture, turned coach, turned advisor, all of it, right? My career is not linear. Most people's careers are not linear. Mom of 2, I have a 10th grader who's 16. I have a almost 8-year-old who's in 2nd grade. And let me tell you, homeschooling is no fun for anyone. So my kids are finally back in school, which is awesome. But there were times this year where I might have been losing hair in chunks. So that's me. I love working with startups, and I've had such a fun time working with Eleanor and Nikhil to give them strategic guidance on how to think about their approach to market and how they support their customers like you guys.
Fantastic. Thank you for that great introduction. You gave a bunch of really good teasers to some of the conversation points I want to touch on. But I think let's maybe start at the beginning. How did you land your first role in tech?
Yeah, it was a combination of both like happenstance and personality. So I attended Mass College of Art for a few years, and my plans changed when I had my first baby at 23, and I had to work full time. So I transitioned into working at a hospital and doing like appointment scheduling, and I realized that I hated being in my chair at a certain time, and I was like, get me out of this weird situation where if my ass is not in my chair at 8 a.m. I'm in trouble. Like that just doesn't work for me. And so I was doing some waitressing. I started waitressing. My first waitressing job was when I was 14. And if I waited on you at that age, I apologize now. I had no business waitressing at 14, but I learned a lot of people skills. And so during high school, during college, and after college, I did a lot of waitressing and bartending. For any of you who are familiar with Inman Square in Cambridge, the East Coast Grill and Raw Bar is where I learned to love food. And when I was waitressing, there were a variety of different places that I worked. Single mom, living at home with my parents, and working at night. And there was a restaurant that I worked at where there was a mill building across the street and had a ton of tech companies in it. And I never thought I would get into tech. It wasn't intentional, but I had customers coming in who I got to know, and they worked for like this super cool video game startup, and they were super awesome. They were artists and designers and engineers, and I just formed a relationship with them, and the impression was a good one. I was myself, and because I was curious and I was approachable and I was willing to meet my customers' needs, I got offered a job to go be their reception office manager admin for the whole company. It was a tiny little video game startup with about 30 something people, and I wore every hat. And I think the takeaway for you guys from that is when you can be your authentic self, people see that and they'll know whether or not it will fit in their culture. So making sure that you're always coming forward as your authentic self is probably the one key takeaway from that. And that was my foray into what then became, I'm on my 9th startup and I'm advising at 4. So I'm a little crazy in a good way.
Yeah, I think it is really interesting. I think for most people, I think in the press, they say like, oh, you went to Stanford or you went to MIT and then you got a job at Google and then you joined a startup. And then there's this myth that everyone kind of gets into tech after doing a computer science degree. And what I have found is that's just, I think that's just what the journalists want to write about, because most of the colleagues I've worked with, especially most of the mentors, right? Like tech started what, late 70s, and that was just tiny, the garage stories. And then you have, especially in Boston, a growing startup scene, but a lot of, you're trying to find talent from anywhere because people didn't come out of tech. And I think it is really interesting how you said, you were just being curious and approachable and ask people questions. And they said, yeah, come, I want to spend more time with Jillian, come work for us. So you mentioned that you wore a lot of hats. So I think this is one of the things that I think is one of the biggest differences in tech and startups than I think other industries, right? If you're a teacher all day. And granted, a teacher does a lot of different roles besides just teaching. But can you tell us a little bit more about what that means to wear every hat? And then also if you're being, and yeah, what does that mean?
I think part of it depends on the scale of the organization. So a lot of companies claim to be startups, but they might be further along than others. And so one of the things you want to understand is like, how big is the company? How far along are they? If they've got more than 50 employees, you're not going to have to probably wear a lot of hats. If they have less than 20 employees, you're probably going to have to wear at least a couple. And you're going to want to try different things. Like you kind of, when you get in these startups that are really small, you kind of get to like dip your toe in over here in accounting, and you get to dip your toe over here in like event marketing. And then like all of a sudden you're supporting fundraising. And so you get to try these different things. There was a point in my career early on where I got really interested in product management. And I dove into learning how to do agile methodologies in engineering, scoping, and planning. And I realized that while agile was something that I could do really well, it didn't bring me joy. I didn't want to just do product management. And so then I figured, how do I take that agile methodology and how do I apply project management with an agile flavor into some of the other things that I was doing more in the front of the house of the business, kind of in operations and administration. I think the other thing that's important is, you have to be willing to take the hats off when it's time. And that's really hard for folks. So when you get into like your first startup and you are everywhere, you're like the octopus. You have a tentacle in everything, and everybody's like, you're my go-to. I'm gonna go to you to get it done. You do have a little bit of grief when you start to take off some of those hats. And I think that's important to think about, is that's just a natural growing stage for an organization. I tend to like to outpace the growth of an organization once it starts to get to it's set and forget, meaning it's kind of humming, it's operating. And so usually when I get to an organization and I've been with them for a while and they're like over 300 or 400 people, that's usually when I'm like, nope, I want to go do it again. And so, I make my relationships and I cultivate those, and then I move on to the next adventure. and that's welcomed and it's supported, because people know that that's where I shine, and it's not seen as a loss or a departure in a negative way.
Yeah, that's a really good point. So I think as an outsider, when I talk to folks, they say, "Oh, so you're a startup or you're a tech company," and to them, it's kind of this homogenous, especially from Silicon Valley, like, "Oh, it's like you're scrappy, you're figuring things out." Like, "Oh, I could never handle that risk." But a lot of startups are 300, 400 people and have been around for 5 to 10 years. Can you going back to the topic of culture, can you tell us a little bit more about how this culture change as it gets from smaller to bigger? So we talked about the individual. What does it mean? Yeah, what are some of the changes as you get from a small company to a big company? And then I guess another question is number of employees the biggest predictor of stability in the company? What are other traits to kind of look out for?
Yeah, I think that's a really interesting approach to how we should frame this. Is stability comes in a variety of different ways. So stability should be related to what your risk tolerance is. If your risk tolerance is that I'm willing to accept a job offer from a company where my salary and my benefits are being met, and I have confidence that that's going to happen for 12 months, that's your risk tolerance. You'd probably be fine in a startup. If your risk tolerance is that you're seeking a job where you can have confidence that you're going to grow and you're going to develop and you're going to be there for 5 to 10 years, I wouldn't recommend looking at startups because there's a lot of volatility in the market. Sometimes organizations grow through being acquired by other companies. So you might decide to go work for a company that has, let's say, 50 employees, and they've already secured their Series A or their Series B fundraise. So they have a lot of money in the bank for that runway in front of them. But then they go and they sell to another organization, and that organization kind of goes through this process where their mission, vision, values is not the same. And then you start to feel like, okay, this is different than what I signed up for. And I'm not sure I want to sign up for what's new here. So I want to maybe go try something somewhere else. And so the level of safety that you have in startups is directly related to how much you are comfortable with from a risk factor.
That's a really I really like that framing, saying, okay, yes, startups have different levels of risk, but also starting with what you can handle and what you were looking for in your next career.
And I want to double click on this because this happens in big companies too.
Yeah.
So I've been acquired. Some of the companies that I've worked for have been acquired, and I have rolled into very large global organizations. And to me, it's like basically sitting there and like having my candle put out, right? It's just not for me. And what's true in those organizations that grow through mergers and acquisitions is that they also have structured layoffs regularly. So they are large organizations who are publicly traded, and the way that they manage their business to hit their margins and to make sure that they're doing what's right for their shareholders is they need to grow and shrink and grow and shrink. And they need to do that with the market. And so you might assume that going to work for a large global company is going to give you more stability than a small startup, when in reality, they probably have 2 to 3 structured layoffs every year.
Yeah. Yeah. It's actually, I was talking to a few outplacement companies. These are companies that employers hire if they're doing layoffs to kind of help people transition to their next job. And they were saying 10 years ago, their outplacement business, to have the business of helping people find better jobs after they've been laid off, was really just one that they use in the recessions. But in the last 10 years, and so we all remember the heyday of 2019 before there was a pandemic and a recession, they still had just as much business as they'd had, in 2013 and 2014. And so I think that's a really important point, that it's actually, startups have one type of risk where you are going to wear more hats, as you said, and it's going to grow and it's going to shift and it's going to change, and it also may not exist. But then a larger company, there is more that kind of startup mentality, that growth, that change is actually kind of percolating and affecting.
How do you add my
as well.
Simon. Yeah, Simon, you have a question? No? Okay. I need to say hi to my very good friend, Lynn. Thank you for joining. So good to see you. So I think the other thing that I want to go back to is you asked about like how does culture evolve as the
Yeah.
organization grows? And there's this really interesting statistic. It's probably even changed a bit since I heard it a few years ago, but it said that the reality of your culture is most indicative in the last 50 people that were hired,
Hmm.
right? Because what ends up happening is as your company grows and your culture evolves, because it will evolve, the people who are newer in the organization are taking what they learn as they see it and as they're coming in, and they're taking what they brought in from the outside and they're putting it all into the pot. And then what they're doing is when they're coming in, they're influencing those around you. So the organization should appropriately evolve its culture. The things that do need to stay true are the mission and the vision and the values. And so what do I mean by mission? And so a lot of people don't like this when I say this, when I speak, but I mean it and it's true. Your company does not exist to give you a job. Your company does not exist to pay you your paycheck or give you benefits. So it doesn't matter what size organization you're in, your company exists because it has a mission. Why does the company exist in the world? It's trying to produce something. It might be a research and development company. It might be a technology company. It might be a pharmaceutical company. It might be a company that exists because they're trying to cure cancer, right? The company exists for a reason, and they happen to have jobs that your skills and competencies would benefit the mission of the business. So if the mission is clear, that's starting point one, right? The mission always has to be clear. It's very unlikely that a mission is going to change unless a company has gone through a massive change, whether they've been acquired or they have shed an area of their business. But mostly that mission is going to stay the same from the time that the business is born to the time that the business no longer exists. So mission is key. I think the other things that are important about the evolution of a culture is organizations should be very clear about who they are and who they are not. And that comes across in the core values. So if a company says that they have, that they value everybody being a rock star and that it's a core value to be a superhuman and it's a core value to be a rock star, well, that's probably indicative of a culture that has a lot of burnout, right?
So true.
Because humans aren't rock stars and humans aren't superheroes. Now, you need to dig in during the interview process, and you need to dig in when you're reading on Glassdoor, and you need to dig in when you're doing your back channel references, and you need to look at what does it mean? If they have superheroes whose superpowers are things like empathy and listening, then you probably want to keep looking at that company, right? They're conflating rock starism with just humanity. So, maybe they're not good at delivering how. But if the underlying behavior is like these really core basic emotional quotient human to human skills that they value, then that's like a good set of values that you're going to want to kind of jump on that train and ride. I think the other thing is like around this concept of like, how does positive culture get enforced? And we're all messy. Like, I don't show up every day my best self. You don't show up every day your best self. Kristen doesn't, Christy doesn't, Matt doesn't. Like, we all have these moments where we're not our best selves. What's indicative of like a healthy culture is how does the organization respond when people are in low self? And so those are the types of things you're going to want to ask in your interview process is like, how do you enforce your culture when people are off track? Right? When people aren't showing up their best selves, how does your culture support them? How do your guardrails support them? What are the behaviors that will not be tolerated? And in which ways will they not be tolerated? How does the business respond to those things? Right? So it's enforcing the culture in a way where it's going back to the fact that we're all messy in the first place and that the business exists for the mission. And then how do we use the guardrails of the values to align how we behave with each other, not just in the business. How do we behave with our customers? How do we behave with our partners? How do we behave with our vendors? If you're treating your coffee guy like shit, That's wrong. Right? So like it's this culture of, do they embrace that humans are the capital in the business?
Yeah, there's a lot to dig into there. Maybe we
Another session.
Yeah, I just so much to dig into. So I think, okay, how about I want to double click on a lot of it, but maybe let's add a frame. Um, I would like to kind of go back. So you're currently the head of culture at Slim.AI, where you are, and head of culture is actually not a very common term or title. What does a head of culture do? What do you do as a head of culture? And going back to the questions that you are recommending we ask in an interview, how do you set and enforce a positive culture? And then also, I think there's just a bigger question. As you said, culture is a combination of the last 50 people's behavior, mission, and the values of the company. But not every company has their explicit mission, has explicit core values. Been at too many companies account where we go through a core values exercise and what comes out is like gobbledygook dictionary words that you never use in every day, and you're like, I don't know what that means. So tell us, what does a head of culture do? What do you do? How do you, when people ask you those questions of, when someone does something bad, how do you instead enforce it? And what does this mean? What does culture mean for an organization and for a person?
So I don't want to spend too much time on it because I'm not sure that all of our listeners are going to be like really jazzed up about culture. So I'll be really brief about it.
Okay.
What I do is I partner with everyone in the organization, every individual contributor, every leader, every department head. I also partner with our board and our advisors and the key contributors in our open source community. And what I do is I support the definition of our mission, our vision, and our values. And then I support building the structures and the processes and the tools to make sure that those thrive, right? Not enforce. And that's an important nuance, right? So I exist in my role to do things like cross-reference a non-disclosure agreement with a formal advisor for the business to make sure that not just the legalese is correct, but that it's clear what is the relationship that we're going to have with that advisor. How are we going to work with them? What benefit are they going to bring to our organization, and what benefit are we going to bring to them as a human or a developer or a business leader, right? In addition to that, there's a lot of scaffolding. So things like handbooks and offer letters and supporting of recruitment pipelines, interacting with our board of directors. There's a lot that goes in and out of it. I would say the thing that brings me the most joy is like being the sounding board for when people are like, oh, I came across something that I don't know what to do with it. What would you suggest? Right? And most of that has to do with communication. And so I don't exist to be a mediator. I am not like the HR door that's always open and come in, right? Lynn's gonna laugh at me, but like, don't open my door and complain to me. Do not come in bitching, moaning, and whining. Come in and say, I'm struggling with something. Here's what I tried. It didn't work. What would you recommend? Right? So I exist to be that kind of internal coach and advisor to make sure that we're setting and resetting where needed.
I love that.
Yes. Okay. So hold on. What are some good questions asked during interviews to filter out company bad culture? Okay. I'll take that one first. So Eden, I would say, try not to use the term bad culture. I think one of the things that we do as humans is we associate good and bad. When in reality, everybody's messy. Companies are messy. They're full of messy people, right? And so what you want to suss out is, things like, when there is a conflict, how is it addressed? So Eden, you could say, maybe you're talking to a prospective hiring manager and you say, if I were your employee and I was having a conflict with one of my peers, how would you address it? And if they say things like, oh, I would go talk to that person's manager, you're going to probably want to be like, why aren't you teaching me how to have healthy conflict, right? So you want to think about like culturally, How do they manage those types of things? But more importantly, you want to ask questions about how you thrive. And this is a really important one for all of us. Think about a teacher, a mentor, a parent, a family member, someone in your life who you look up to, who was there for you, and they helped create an environment for you to thrive. Were they the type of person who was sitting next to you saying, let me show you how to do this. I'm going to teach you how to do it, and then I'm going to let you go try. Or were they the type of person who said, I'll push you off the cliff and you just raise your hand if you need the flotation device, I'll throw it to you. We all thrive differently. So you want to suss out whether or not the hiring manager and the team and the organization create the environment that you can thrive in. Some people actually like to be pushed off a cliff and say, I got it. I'm going to try this on my own. I'll let you know if I need help. So you want to think about culture directly related to how you thrive. And you also want to think about culture directly related to what are your non-negotiables. So when I was an administrative professional, as an executive assistant to CEOs, you get a lot of weird requests, and some of it's just like not appropriate. So my guardrail was, if it's not illegal and it's not immoral and it helps my leader be a better version of themselves, I'll probably do it, right? There are lots of things, like if I'm going to go to the dry cleaner and grab their clothes, that's what I'm going to do, because it's better for me on my salary to go get the laundry than it is for them on their salary to waste their time doing it, right? We want them focused on the business. So you want to think about, what are your non-negotiables? Do you have family that you're supporting? Do you have someone that you're taking care of? Like, do you have an organization that expects you to work 70 hours a week? You might not thrive in that, right? Some people do. They always burn out. Cliff note, they always burn out. So ask questions about thriving. Eden, let me know if that was helpful, and if you want any more pointers on that. I want to go to Joy's question next. Oh, good. Okay. How to support professional development and career growth. So Eleanor's going to ask me a question about how do you show up in your job in the first, 30, 60, 90 days. So I'm just going to jump to that. So what you want to do is you want to have ownership of your professional development. I, as the head of culture, support that by engaging with my employees to say, is there a methodology or a tool or a skill set that you don't possess today that you're curious about that you think would benefit you? But I'm not doing that unless they're coming to me and saying, can we have a professional development chat? And they're also talking to their hiring manager and their leader regularly in one-on-ones about their professional development. So the things that I look for when I'm thinking about hiring someone into a startup, I look for curiosity, I look for self-reflection, and I look for aptitude. And part of the aptitude bucket is you know enough to ask for the training that you believe that you need, right? You know enough, you're self-reflective enough to say, I'm over my skis. I don't actually know this. Do I need to go learn a tool? Do I need to take time to research? Do I need to go listen in on, some other experts talking about these things? So that's the aptitude, right? You take your baseline skills, competencies that you have today, because those are going to keep evolving. And then you say in your career growth, I know that I need these soft skills and these hard skills because I suck at them, right? That's your self-reflection. Your self-reflection is, where are you not strong? And when you're really self-reflective, you can ask questions like, am I the thing that's holding the project, the program, or the procedure back? Am I holding it back because I'm an ego and I'm all being stubborn because I know how to do it and I'm not listening to the team? Am I preventing because, I haven't called out that we have a budget gap? Am I preventing us from being successful because I'm afraid of going to my manager and telling them that everyone on the team thinks this is a bad idea and no one will say it? Right? Because that happens in startups. So think about the self-reflection, think about the aptitude, and then the curiosity. So another thing that's important around your career development is, especially when you're in tech or you're transitioning into tech, you need to ask questions. And you need to ask questions followed with gratitude, not apology. And you can use this everywhere in your life. I'm so sorry I was late for the meeting. No, you're not. Thank you for waiting for me. I was just grabbing my lunch. Sounds really different, doesn't it? Hey, I don't know where this is. I need you to show me. Thank you for taking the time to show me. Not, I'm sorry, I can't find it. Nobody wants that little mousy apology, right? Show gratitude because you mean it. You're asking someone for their time. You're asking someone for their resources. You're asking someone to fill into you what you need to be resourceful and effective. So show that with gratitude.
Yeah. And then jumping on that, I think going back to what you said earlier, right? The company exists to solve them to achieve a mission, right? And so every time as an employee, when you ask, hey, how can I be better? What could, like, I need this, you're doing that so that you can help the entire team achieve its mission. Definitely. Yeah. Natalie asked a really good question too, kind of on the other boat, right? So we're talking about kind of growth and this and curiosity and thankfulness. And then there's also, which oftentimes people say, oh, this is a young person's game. She's asking for older and seasoned talent. Is it worth applying to tech companies?
Absolutely. And here's why. You may be scared to do so. If you're scared to do it, that means it's a growth opportunity for you. If you're scared to do it, it means you get to go into your growth zone. You will be a better version of yourself if you challenge yourself by going into those growth zone modes. So if you're saying to yourself, I'm too old for this, I can't learn new tricks, you're limiting yourself by having those thoughts and those beliefs. When in reality, you're going to bring a lot to the table. This, like, the topic of diversity, equity, belonging, inclusion. Well, diversity includes age, right? Diversity includes age. Like, I love spending time with people who are like just about to retire because they look at the world so differently than I do. And I can learn from that, right? I love working with people who don't have my background. I love working with people who are like the staunch engineers who are like, headphones on, coding for hours, right? And like, they don't want to talk, they're not extroverted. And when I do get them, I'm like, ooh, I get to learn something new, right? So you really want to think about diversity of experience. You want to think about diversity of perspective. That includes age, right? And think about the volume of wisdom that you bring to the table that a young person doesn't have, right? And you can help guide the organization because you likely have a lot of patience that you've developed over your lifetime that maybe some folks younger in career don't have.
Definitely. Definitely. I think it's really key, right? No candidate, even if they are the same age, the same race, the same school, is the same, right? Every single person brings something unique to the table. And I think to your point earlier about, one, being your authentic self, being very clear about the value you bring, why, what you're excited to continue to, which of your skills and experiences and personality traits you want to continue to use and leverage, and what parts of your personality, and also what areas you want to grow in, and why you're excited in the mission. Is those are the things that should determine whether you decide you want to join a company or not your age, not your race, not your school, there's none of those other pieces, right? What matters is this a challenge that you want to take on?
Well, and there's another caveat to that, which is important. The pace of execution in startups is fast. The volume of work is fast. Change is constant. If you do not thrive in change and you are not willing to thrive in change, that's when I would have you pause on whether or not you want to go into a startup, especially in technology.
That's a good point. Definitely a good point. So jumping back to sort of like linking this piece of the fact that change is constant and also being curious. We've talked about the kinds of questions to ask in the interview. What are the types of questions that someone should be asking in the first 30 days? So they've gotten the job, they said, okay, I want to take on this challenge. How, the company is moving so fast. What should you be asking? What should you be doing to thrive and succeed in this new tech company?
So you should consider your first 90 days as your land and learn. You're landing and you're learning, right? You're going to bring skills and competencies to the table that will come to bear that will benefit the team. That can't happen if you're not learning what already exists. So you need to take time to actually read the handbook. There's context in there that's important. You need to take time to get to know people on your team. And I don't mean just like, oh, hey, I have a cat and I have a cat, right? Like actually get to know people. Book a coffee with them. If it's over Zoom, fine, right? But like spend time learning who the other humans are that you're sharing space with, even if it's virtual space. Because what ends up happening is you create common understanding and you create mutual caring and mutual respect. When you can create common understanding and mutual caring and mutual respect, then people are excited to hear your ideas. So you might walk into something and you're like, ooh, well, this procurement process is a hot mess over here. Like, I have never seen worse procurement in my life, right? But nobody's going to listen to you if you don't take the time to get to know people, to try the process as it exists, and then influence for the better. So when you're getting in for those first 90 days, you've got to learn the people, you've got to learn the processes, you've got to like internalize the mission. And I don't mean just like read it and be able to like repeat it. Internalize it. Like, what does it mean? You work for a company that has a mission. Know what that means and know how you play a part in that, right? And in your first 90 days, the part you play in that is learning how the organization currently brings their mission to bear. Only when you learn that can then you influence improvements. Only when you learn that can you be a part of that team, right? And so you really want to think about in those first 90 days, how do you become part of that team? And imposter syndrome is real. It's going to happen. It doesn't matter if you're changing verticals. It doesn't matter if you're going from non-tech into tech. Every time you start a new company, you're like, I hope they don't actually see that I can't do this. I hope that they don't think I'm incompetent. I don't feel like I belong here, right? That is real. Imposter syndrome is so real, and you got to give yourself grace and not let it drive your behavior. Right? We talked about like, hey, thank you for showing me this. I know you already showed me. I forgot. Show me again and I won't forget. Another analogy I want you to think about is, especially in tech startups, the organization moves kind of like a tornado. There's not a lot of rhyme or reason, right? It's literally just like everybody getting together to try and figure it out. FITFO, if you'd like to use that term, right? Figure it the fuck out, right? It's a tornado. You're walking into a tornado, and guess what's happening? Is like all these people are spinning around you, and you're like, oh, cow, oh, car, right? And like you're just trying to find your footing. You need to be able to pull things out of the tornado to find your footing. Sometimes that's asking for help. Sometimes that's researching. Sometimes, you know what that is? That's asking if you can sit in a cross-functional meeting to learn how another team or another department does something, right? You're a student, so you need to observe and you need to learn.
I think that's a really, really helpful metaphor, just the idea of a tornado. I think across all industries, very few companies have good onboarding processes, and here's what you need to learn, and here's the software, and here's how we do things. But especially in a startup, I think this tornado metaphor is really great because things are moving so fast, and you create processes and then 6 months later they're outdated because you've grown. And I love saying these suggestions of one, sitting in a meeting, cross-functional meeting, sitting in a manager's meeting, think of yourself as a student, learning the processes that do exist, and then thinking about, okay, how do I contribute to this growth?
Yeah. And if you're like one of those people who like, you love spreadsheets, right? You love data and you love math and you love spreadsheets and you love Gantt charts, and like, if you go into a startup and you're like, let me put this 37 step process into place to improve our blah, 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 people are going to be like, we don't do that here. So you have to find a way to influence. If you know it's going to benefit the business to help achieve the mission, you got to find the way to influence.
Yeah.
And sometimes you have to adapt your style.
This is a huge topic, thinking about, okay, the culture that you're entering, how do you understand it, and then how do you influence? I definitely want to double click on that. Yeah, I guess can you give me an example of someone you've worked with first 30 days, 3 months, where they did this really well, where they did the land and learn, or the land and learn, and then especially if, and I mean, I imagine that you've done this a lot, of you go in and
I've had to write my own onboarding plan at every startup that I've gone to. Let's just be clear, right? Like, you're absolutely right. My skylight's kind of shining. Sorry about that. You're absolutely right. Like, the onboarding process tends to be non-existent. It just tends to not be there. And you're like, let me grab this, let me grab this, let me grab this. So what you do when you're doing that is you create that for the next person, right? So you get to be the author of what will be better for the next person. And that's super fun in startups. You know, the other thing too is like, so much of your onboarding plan and how you're successful in those first 90 days needs to be not just you're going to write a list of all the things that you're going to read, but you're going to read them and then you're going to talk about them, right? You're going to sit down with your leader and your team and you're going to say, I need more context. I read this about this customer, or I read this about this business development partner, but I still don't understand. Give me more context, right? So if you want to be successful in your first 30, 60, 90 days, you have to ask clarifying questions. What do I mean by a clarifying question? A clarifying question is, I hear you saying X, Y, and Z, but I don't actually understand what that means in the concept of this discussion. Walk me through it a different way. Right? And then express gratitude for them taking the time to do that. Another way to ask a clarifying question is you try to repeat back what you think their intent is. I believe what you're trying to convey to me is that the sky is purple. Is that true? And then they say, no, that's not what I said at all. And you say, okay, great. Can you try explaining it a different way? Or can you try using a different approach? Right? And then express gratitude for them walking you through it. So the clarifying questions are really important. You want to ask clarifying questions based on your own assumptions and judgments, right? If you look at a process and you say, I am judging this as being garbage, it is disorganized, it is not helpful, it is unclear. And if you go forward with that behavior, you're not seeking to understand. Someone might be like, oh, I wrote that in like 5 minutes because nothing existed. Please go make it better. And that's probably going to be the answer in a startup, right? The answer is probably going to be, that's just the best we could do at that time. We had 4 people. Well, yeah. We don't have 4 people anymore. And now you're here to contribute. So find a way to contribute.
Yeah, absolutely. I think that ties an earlier theme that you were mentioning, right? This is, at the end of the day, right? A company exists for its mission, but it's a sea of messy humans who get to be this thing we call the company. And so just going in with the expectation that everyone is trying to do their best, and there's probably a reason, and either because, it doesn't look great because, to your point, it was done 6 months ago when there were 4 people in the company, right, or something needed to happen, or someone had a bad day that day, and And so going in, as you said, I love this example of this phrasing of, okay, saying here's what you need and then expressing gratitude, and as opposed to kind of being meek, mousy, and saying sorry. I'm
Yeah,
not
just
with
don't
you.
apologize for asking questions. Like, just never apologize for asking a question. Never start a question with, this is going to sound dumb, but,
Yes.
because you just made it sound dumb.
Let's strike that. Let's strike that from the
It
vocabulary.
can't be, it's not allowed anymore. I think the other thing that's really fun about startups are kind of like silly putty, right? Like, they're soft, they're squishy, they're moldable. And when you try to put them into like too tight of a construct, they tend to not stay in that shape, right? And so if you're the type of person who really likes structure and you thrive in structure, I don't think you want to look at a startup unless it's very well established and there is a lot of structure, there is a lot of policy, there is a lot of procedure already in place. And so you're going to want to look for those organizations that are like Series C, Series D, meaning that they've raised multiple rounds of funding and they're probably either looking at an IPO or looking at being acquired. So what happens in that phase of the business is they have to get all their ducks in a row. They have to have everything documented. They have to have all their file structures clean, right? They have to be ready to start acting like a publicly traded company, which means they can't be messy or loosey-goosey anymore. So you might love structure and you might want to try a startup, but I would say go like Series C, Series D, where they're pretty organized and they got their S together to some extent, right?
Absolutely. So we have about 10 minutes left, and there's two topics, or one big topic I want to cover, and then Ty had a really good question. So I think we'll cover Ty's question and then jump into work-life balance and competing responsibilities, especially from parents. But Ty's question is, there's this trend of testing job applicants in the recruiting process, especially in tech. What are your thoughts on that?
Well, there's definitely implicit bias in it, right? So it depends on who wrote the test and what their perspective was when they wrote it. So, there is bias in testing. That's just something that we know to be true. My 16-year-old doesn't have an executive function bone in her body. So you give that kid a test, she fails, right? But if you sit her in a room with someone who can guide her and help her, she will thrive, right? So I want you to think about the concept of testing as it's just one data point that hiring managers can use, but it doesn't tell the whole story. So I have a very dear friend of mine who, I was talking to her like maybe this time a year and a half ago, and she goes, I suck at interviewing. And I was like, tell them that. She was like, what? I'm like, well, when you sit down, tell them that your strength is not interviewing. Tell them that you haven't actually sat down in an interview for 12 years because your last two jobs were consecutive and you didn't have to interview. Tell them that. And she was like, it worked so well. She's like, everybody laughed and then we just moved on and we had like this great conversation and it turned out that wasn't the job for me, but I said the same thing in my next interview and now I'm happy as a clam because I'm where I want to be, right? So you want to think about testing as just one piece of the component. Testing can be on technical skills, testing can be on soft skills, testing can be to see how you react when you're uncomfortable, right? And so you want to think about that as it's not necessarily an open and shut case. It's just one more thing that they look at when they're trying to consider the holistic approach. So if you know you're bad at taking tests, you should tell them that. If tests give you anxiety, you should tell them that because that's your authentic self. You don't want to be the square peg in the round hole or the round peg in the square hole, right? You want to thrive. And if you can't be your authentic self because maybe testing is part of that job regularly and it's going to stress you the heck out, you don't want that job.
Definitely. Yeah. I think the recruiting process, if you there are some elements, right? You go through the interview process, you might have a series of final round interviews. Those are uncomfortable. And I like to tell our JobStep clients, the only people who are good at interviewing are narcissists, because no one else has practiced talking about themselves. But so there's always some level of discomfort in the interviewing process, but if it really feels like, oh, they're testing me on this kind of thing, or they're asking me these types of questions. Or actually, one of our clients was looking for more of a management role, and actually decided to say no to a company because he had gotten to the final round interview and they had not once asked him about how he wanted to empower his team. How did he mentor his team? He had never once met any of the people he might be managing, or his direct or his report. It was all on kind of individual contributor pieces. And he was like, this just feels like you're looking for someone to be in a management role, but you're only testing me on the skills I wouldn't use. And so, figuring out, there's, to the extent that you can get multiple interviews, which is what we do at JobStep, give yourself that choice and give yourself the freedom to say, I'm also assessing. I think that's a really key.
Yeah. I mean, you should be assessing them too, right? Like you should have your own perspective. So when they give you an assessment, you can say, I'd like to understand, what do you look for in the output of these assessments? Like, what are you actually looking for? Are you trying to understand how quickly I can accomplish a task? Are you trying to understand whether or not I will get nervous? Are you trying to understand whether I have a hard skill, right? So one of the things that we do at our organization, poor Eleanor, she's not gonna like this. We don't look at resumes at all.
I love it. I love it. That's perfect.
We literally, in our technical team, if you go to our GitHub page where we have our open roles, it says, our CTO specifically says, do not send me a resume. Send me a few sentences about yourself and why you think you would want to consider working with us. And before you do that, read all of our principles and our values. Check us out. It's like dating, right? Like, do we look good? Do you want to learn more? So you've got to do your dating, right? Like, you're gonna want to do, like, obviously the things that JobStep can help you with are awesome, but like, try to do like a back channel reference.
Exactly.
Right? Like, LinkedIn is like the best tool on earth. Find somebody who knows somebody who knows somebody, randomly reach out to them on LinkedIn and say, hey, I'm applying for a job at this company. I see that you used to work there, but for a very short period of time. Any chance I can get 20 minutes of your time? And get the real deal. Right?
Yeah, it's a great piece of advice. Yes. Yeah, it is a two-way street, and it should be a two-way street, right? Like, to your point, it's a sea of messy humans who are working together, and you should know what set of messy humans are you going to be are you going to, decide to spend your time with, when you could be spending your time with someone else.
Yep.
Okay, so we have, this is probably not enough time to get into.
I will keep going. If folks want to stick around, no problem. We can go longer.
But the last question was really on, right, there is this myth that people in tech are all in their 20s, they don't have kids, they don't have health problems, they're just, magical people who can work 80-hour weeks, which I have met maybe 2 of those. So can you, for people who have other responsibilities, where they're caring for their parents or kids, or have hobbies or other things in their life, should they consider a job in tech? Should they, how do you balance, how does work-life balance work in tech? And I know tech is very different. We've talked about how different it can be, but
yeah.
Well,
I've done it well and not well in my life. There have been times where I've worked so much that my hair was falling out in chunks. There have been times where I worked so much that I wasn't sleeping. There are times that I worked so much that my brain could not turn off. And so, if you choose technology, you also have to be intentional about how you support yourself, right? And so you can't be the best version of yourself if you're not filling your own bucket. And so if you're not filling your own bucket, you're not going to be your best self. Your work is going to be less than stellar. you likely are going to get passed up for things like promotions, raises, lateral moves, etc. Because what's happening is you've gassed yourself out, and that's on you. So when you work in tech, you need to set healthy boundaries, and you need to communicate with other people what's important to you, right? I have a client of mine who has an autoimmune deficiency, and she has not conveyed that to her leader. And so she works her tail off Monday through Friday, and she can barely get out of bed on Saturday, Sunday. And then she does it all over again because she's fearful of communicating that she has an autoimmune disease. Working on it, right? But if you have to hide your authentic self, like if you pretend that your kids aren't a big part of your life, that's not your authentic self. If you pretend that like your cats and dogs aren't important, that's not your authentic self, right? So I think the other thing that's really important is like, you need to be clear with your kids. So my daughter's 16 and she's got tons of social emotional needs. She's like one of the most creative people I've ever met, singer, songwriter, artist, sucks at organization, right? Cannot keep track of anything. And you know what she said to me about a year ago? She said, it's exhausting to be around you because you're so perfect. I was like, shit. I was like, that's all I've ever shown her. She thinks I don't make mistakes. And I do a lot. And so then you have to figure out like, how do you create authentic and healthy opportunities to show your kids that you're fallible, right? You don't want to like go break down and cry in their lap, right? It's got to be appropriate. But, you know, one of the examples I used with her was like, hey, listen, you know how you procrastinate? I do too. I was like, I'm really bad at paying bills. I was like, that bill over there, I've gotten like 4 of them. Now I have to pay 3 times as much. And I have to own that. I have to own the outcome of that, right? So when you're thinking about like, how do you balance work and life? They're the same thing. It's your life, right? Work is a component of it. Your hobbies are a component of it. Your children or your cats or your love of travel, right? If you love traveling, find a company that doesn't have any offices. Find a company that's completely asynchronous, right? Find a company where like you can literally go work from a beach in Hawaii and nobody cares. They'll all be jealous, right? But it's not going to affect your ability to impact the outcomes of the business.
Perfect. I think that is a really great note to, if not end, but at least pause and say thank you. That I think that's right, right? Part of, I think a couple things from there's so many good takeaways from this, but I think one of them is this is, as when you're interviewing, as much the employers vetting you as much as you vetting them. And then when you're looking at culture, think of it less as good and bad culture and more, is it a culture that fits how you thrive? And so there's a lot of self-reflection in that, and probably a lot of exploration and figuring it out over, and it probably changes as your life changes. And then I think there's just such diversity in tech. We've talked about the smaller companies and larger companies and different ways to suss out stability. So thank you. I think that is really wonderful. I want to take a pause here. I want to give people a chance if you want to head out. One thing I would like to do is just kind of share our socials and a way to keep in touch with Jillian, with JobStep. Excuse the janky slide. We are also an early stage startup, so still working on some of our processes. But thank you everyone for coming. This is one of many events that we're planning over the summer. Thank you, Jillian, for your wonderful advice. You can follow Jillian on LinkedIn. You can follow JobStep on the many socials. We're not yet on TikTok. That is a challenge for a future date. If you are interested in working with one of our many great coaches who happen to be on our call, like Max and Joy and Ty and myself, you can sign up for JobStep at our website. And then we have upcoming events. 2 weeks, my co-founder and some of our coaches are going to be talking about how to reverse engineer the applicant tracking system. And you get an inside look at what we do at JobStep to ensure that our job seekers get interviews. And then on the 17th, we're talking with another customer success leader who transitioned from the hospitality world into sales in the tech world and now in customer success. And so I think hopefully that will inspire others to make similar transitions.